Right now, in the pre-dawn darkness of the Persian Gulf, the tanker Astro Gemini is sitting dead in the water. She is a VLCC, a very large crude carrier, loaded with 1 million barrels of Saudi crude oil, enough to fuel the entire country of Germany for 3 days. Her captain received the warning over maritime radio just before 0300 local time. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps vessels were conducting live fire exercises in the Strait of Hormuz. All commercial traffic was ordered to hold position or reverse course. The Astro Gemini stopped, and so did 11 other tankers behind her. On the bridge, the captain watches the radar screen. The waterway ahead, the narrowest navigable point of which is just 21 nautical miles wide, shows no commercial traffic moving east or west. That has never happened during business hours in the modern era of maritime trade, not during the tanker war of the 1980s, not during the 2019 tanker attacks, not during the maximum pressure campaign of 2020. The Strait of Hormuz has always, until this moment, remained open to the movement of oil. That threshold has now been crossed. Here's what the mainstream media is not telling you. The closure of Hormuz is not simply a naval standoff. It is the activation of a pressure mechanism that was architected over 4 decades, stress-tested in smaller confrontations, and is now being deployed at full scale for the first time in history. Within 72 hours, the consequences will not be confined to tanker insurance premiums or diplomatic statements. They will be visible in fuel prices, food prices, currency markets, and the strategic calculations of governments from Tokyo to New Delhi to Washington. Governments that have, until this morning, told their populations that the oil supply chain was secure. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly 3 things. First, the precise sequence of decisions and miscalculations that made this morning's closure not a surprise, but an inevitability in retrospect. Second, how the closure of a 21-mile waterway produces a cascade of economic shocks that reaches your grocery bill within days, not months. And third, the 3 scenarios that are now genuinely on the table, including the one that strategic analysts discuss privately, but that no government will name publicly. Stay with me, because this one matters. To understand what just happened, you have to go back to September 14, 2019. That morning, swarms of cruise missiles and drones struck the Abqaiq oil processing facility in Saudi Arabia, the single largest oil processing installation on Earth, responsible for handling roughly 7% of global daily supply. The attack, which the United States and Saudi Arabia attributed to Iran and its proxies despite Iranian denials, briefly knocked out more than 5% of global oil output in a single night. Oil prices spiked nearly 15% at the open. And then, within a week, the world largely moved on. That recovery was possible because the Abqaiq facility was damaged, not destroyed, and because the Strait of Hormuz remained open. Saudi oil still moved. The physical infrastructure of supply was temporarily impaired, not severed. The markets absorbed the shock. What the Abqaiq attack told Iranian planners, however, was something far more significant than what it told Western markets. It told them that the world had a near miss it did not fully appreciate. And it told them that the true lever, the one that would not produce a temporary spike, but a sustained global disruption, was not any individual facility. It was the Strait itself. Between 2019 and 2022, Iran systematically documented the vulnerabilities of the Strait closure scenario. It seized vessels. It harassed shipping. It laid mines in exercises. It developed and deployed fast attack boat swarms and shore-based anti-ship missile systems, including the Ra'ad and Noor variants of the Chinese C-802, capable of targeting supertankers from fixed positions on Iranian coastline. It mapped, in painstaking detail, exactly how the 30 to 40 tankers that transit the Strait on any given day could be stopped. Then, between 2022 and 2024, the strategic landscape shifted in Iran's favor in 2 critical ways. First, the Abraham Accords and subsequent Gulf normalization deals, rather than isolating Iran, produced a regional reconfiguration that reduced the appetite of Arab Gulf states for direct confrontation. The UAE, which had signed normalized relations with Israel, found itself deeply uncomfortable being seen as the base of operations for a Western naval escalation against Iran. That political reluctance constrained the operational flexibility of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, which is headquartered in Bahrain. Second, the war in Gaza and the broader axis of resistance mobilization gave Iran a political justification framework, a narrative for domestic and regional consumption, that previous confrontations had lacked. By early 2025, the combination of strategic preparation, political justification, and a calculated reading of American domestic political constraints produced a decision inside the IRGC command structure that had been theoretically on the table for years: a full, declared closure. Not a harassment, not a seizure, a closure. Here is something that no analyst in open-source Western intelligence had seen in modern history before today. A formal broadcast NAVTEX warning, the maritime navigation warning system used to communicate hazards to shipping, issued by Iran's Ports and Maritime Organization declaring the Strait of Hormuz closed to commercial traffic pending resolution of what the notice called illegitimate military provocations threatening the sovereignty of the Islamic Republic. That is not harassment. That is a declaration. And declarations have a different legal, diplomatic, and market logic than provocations. Let us now examine the military dimension of what Iran has actually done and what it has not done, because the distinction matters enormously. The Strait of Hormuz closure, as it currently stands, is not the result of a single dramatic military strike. It is the product of layered denial, what military strategists call anti-access area denial, or A2AD, executed across multiple domains simultaneously. The first layer is mine-laying. IRGC naval vessels have seeded the approaches to the strait with a combination of moored contact mines and influence mines, the latter responding to the acoustic signature, pressure signature, or magnetic field of passing vessels. These are not World War II-era weapons. The influence mines Iran has deployed are domestically produced variants of the Soviet MDM series, capable of target discrimination, meaning they can, in theory, allow military vessels through while targeting commercial tankers. U.S. Navy minesweepers, particularly the Avenger-class MCM vessels, are capable of clearing these, but a full clearance operation of a seeded strait takes days, not hours, and requires a permissive environment. The IRGC is ensuring the environment is not permissive. The second layer is shore-based missile coverage. Iran has deployed Khalij Far's anti-ship ballistic missiles, a precision-guided variant that Iran's IRGC Aerospace Force has claimed can strike moving targets at sea, along the Qeshm Island and Bandar Abbas coastline. The Khalij Fars has a range of approximately 300 kilometers, meaning it covers not only the strait itself but the entire Gulf of Oman approach. If a tanker attempts to move before clearance is established, it is doing so within the engagement envelope of a weapon specifically designed to sink it. The third layer, and this is the layer that complicates the U.S. Navy's calculus most acutely, is fast boat swarm doctrine. The IRGC Navy has spent the better part of 15 years developing a swarming tactic that pairs dozens of small, armed speedboats and coordinated attack patterns designed to overwhelm the close-in defensive systems of larger warships. During IRGC exercises in 2015 and again in 2020, mock attacks on carrier strike group models were publicly demonstrated. The strategic message was explicit. The cost of forcing the strait open by naval power would not be limited to minesweeping. It would involve a direct naval engagement in a confined body of water where the tactical advantage of an aircraft carrier is severely diminished. Here is what this means in operational terms for the United States Fifth Fleet, currently operating from Bahrain. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group is positioned in the northern Arabian Sea, outside the strait, but within striking range of Iranian shore positions. To force the strait open, the strike group would need to conduct simultaneous operations, suppression of shore-based missile systems, minesweeping in an active threat environment, and defense against swarm attacks on supporting vessels. Military strategists in both Washington and London have privately assessed that the opening operation would likely take 72 to 96 hours minimum under contested conditions, and would almost certainly involve U.S. Navy casualties. That is a political threshold that has not been tested since the Gulf War. What military strategists are actually saying, in background briefings and in think tank publications, though not in front of cameras, is that Iran has constructed a scenario in which the cost of restoring access is measurable and concrete, while the cost of not doing so is abstract and delayed. They have made the mathematics of confrontation unfavorable. That is not an accident. That is doctrine. Now let us talk about what this means for you, because this is the section where the geopolitics become personal. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply a shipping lane. It is the exit valve for approximately 21 million barrels of crude oil per day, roughly 21% of total global petroleum liquids consumption. It is also the transit corridor for approximately 20% of global liquefied natural gas trade, the majority of it bound for Japan, South Korea, China, and India. When that valve closes, the pressure does not release gradually. It releases in a cascade, and that cascade has a specific sequence. Within the first 6 hours of a confirmed closure, the immediate market reaction is predictable and already underway. Brent crude, which opened this morning at $83 per barrel, will cross $100 per barrel before New York trading closes today. Historical modeling from the 2019 Abqaiq attack and the 2011 Iran closure threat scenarios shows a minimum 20% spike on day one of a confirmed closure. Some analysts at Goldman Sachs' commodities desk have put the 72-hour ceiling at $130 per barrel if the closure holds, and no credible reopening timeline is established within 24 hours. The last time oil was at $130 was June 2022, and you will remember what that did to the pump. The transmission mechanism from a closed strait to your fuel tank is not a simple price pass-through. It operates through the insurance and routing layer. Within 48 hours of a confirmed closure, Lloyd's of London and its associated war risk underwriters will reclassify the Strait of Hormuz and the northern Persian Gulf as a war risk zone. That reclassification immediately makes it prohibitively expensive, in some cases commercially impossible, to route a tanker through the area. War risk premiums, which were running at approximately 1% of vessel value per voyage before this morning, will climb to 1 to 2% or higher. On a VLCC valued at $100 million, that is a single voyage insurance cost of $1 to $2 million before the cargo. Shipping companies do not absorb that cost. They pass it forward immediately and entirely. The downstream industries affected by this closure form a chain that extends far beyond the fuel sector. Refineries on the U.S. Gulf Coast, in South Korea, in Japan, and in India are calibrated to process specific grades of heavy crude oil that come predominantly from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq, all of which exit through Hormuz. These refineries cannot simply switch to alternative crude grades without significant operational reconfiguration that takes weeks, not days. In the first 72 hours, U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve releases can cushion the domestic market, but the SPR currently holds approximately 360 million barrels, about 18 days of U.S. crude imports at normal run rates, and it cannot solve the problem of refinery calibration. The countries most exposed to a sustained Hormuz closure are the Asian importers. Japan holds approximately 200 days of strategic petroleum reserves on a combination of government and industry stocks, the largest reserve buffer of any importing nation. South Korea holds roughly 180 days. These are the nations that invested in reserve depth after the 1970s oil shocks and have maintained that discipline. China holds somewhere between 90 and 120 days across its strategic, commercial, and emergency layers. The opacity of Chinese reserve data makes precise calculation difficult. India is the most exposed of the major Asian importers, with effective operational reserves of approximately 20 to 25 days when emergency stocks are included. If the Strait remains closed for more than 3 weeks, India faces a genuine supply constraint, not merely a price shock. The food and fertilizer connection is the piece the mainstream coverage will take the longest to explain, so let me put it plainly now. Natural gas is the primary feedstock for ammonia production, and ammonia is the basis for virtually all nitrogen fertilizers. Qatar, which supplies approximately 25% of global LNG trade and the majority of Asia's imported LNG, transits entirely through Hormuz. A sustained closure does not immediately interrupt food supply, but a closure that lasts more than 60 days begins to constrain fertilizer production in countries dependent on Qatari LNG. Agricultural markets begin to price that in within the first 2 weeks. Wheat and corn futures will begin moving this week. This is not abstract economics. This is a direct line from a 21 nautical mile waterway to the price of bread in your city. If you want to understand how this hits your economy before the mainstream media catches up, make sure you are subscribed. The next 72 hours will move faster than the headlines. Let us now examine the diplomatic chessboard, because the military and economic picture cannot be resolved without understanding who is talking to whom, and why each conversation is constrained in ways the public statements do not reveal. The United States public position, delivered by the State Department spokesperson this morning, is predictable in its architecture. A reaffirmation of freedom of navigation as a principle of international law, a call for Iran to immediately reopen the waterway, and a statement that all options remain on the table. That last phrase, all options, is doing significant diplomatic work here. It is a signal to Tehran, but it is also a signal to Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Doha, each of which will be calculating their own exposure and their own leverage in the next 48 hours. Iran's public position, delivered by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in a statement broadcast on state television, frames the closure in explicitly reactive terms, a response to what Tehran describes as an illegal naval encirclement and an act of economic warfare through sanctions. Whether that framing is accepted or rejected internationally matters less than the fact that it gives Iran's domestic audience a defensible narrative, a critical requirement for any government considering de-escalation, which must always be sold as a form of victory rather than retreat. The Gulf states are the actors whose private positions diverge most dramatically from their public ones. Saudi Arabia has called for reopening the Strait. That is the public position. The private position is more complex. Riyadh is simultaneously furious at Iran's action, which directly threatens Saudi oil revenues, and deeply reluctant to be the state that publicly invites American military intervention in the Gulf, given the domestic political costs of that association and the recent Saudi-Iran normalization dialogue brokered in 2023 through Chinese mediation. Saudi Arabia needs the Strait open. It does not want to pay the political price of asking Washington to open it by force. That ambivalence creates space for the mediators. Oman, as it has done repeatedly since the 1980s, is the most likely first callback channel. Muscat has maintained official and functional relations with Tehran throughout every cycle of Gulf tension, and the Omani Foreign Ministry has historically served as the intermediary for preliminary contact in U.S.-Iran and Saudi-Iran negotiations. There are credible reports, not yet confirmed, that the Omani foreign minister has already been in contact with both Tehran and Washington in the hours since the closure was announced. China's role is the most structurally interesting. Beijing brokered the 2023 Saudi-Iran normalization and has substantial economic relationships with both Iran, as its largest oil customer, purchasing Iranian crude at deep discount under sanctions, and with the Gulf states, which are primary customers for Chinese goods and infrastructure investment. China has a direct material interest in the Strait reopening because Chinese importers are among the largest consumers of Gulf crude. But China also has a strategic interest in demonstrating that it can play a constructive mediation role in a crisis of this magnitude, a role that would simultaneously validate its global power ambitions and signal to Washington that Beijing's cooperation on Gulf stability is a variable, not a constant. Expect Chinese statements to be measured but to contain private back-channel activity of significant intensity. The party whose leverage is largest and whose use of it is most uncertain is Pakistan. Islamabad has deep military and economic relationships with Saudi Arabia. Hundreds of thousands of Pakistani workers are employed across the Gulf, and Saudi remittance flows are critical to Pakistan's foreign exchange position. Pakistan also has a complex, often hostile relationship with Iran, but shares a long border. In the 1980s, Pakistan served as a quiet pressure valve in Gulf diplomacy. In the current crisis, Pakistani interlocutors, particularly from the military establishment, may be among the few parties with direct credibility in both Riyadh and Tehran simultaneously. What each side needs to tell its domestic audience is the constraint that makes this situation so difficult to resolve quickly. Iran needs to be able to say that the closure produced a concrete concession, a sanctions relief, a negotiation framework, a guarantee. The United States needs to be able to say that access was restored without a capitulation. Saudi Arabia needs to be able to say that the crisis did not require American military action on its behalf. All three domestic audiences are watching, and the diplomatic architecture has to satisfy all three simultaneously. There are exactly three scenarios that analysts are now modeling, and you need to understand all three, not because any of them is certain, but because each one produces a different set of consequences for your economy and for global stability. The first scenario is a negotiated resolution. And yes, this is possible, despite everything you have just heard. A negotiated resolution requires one thing above all others, a face-saving exit for Iran that does not require the United States to make a public concession. The most likely architecture for this is what could be called a sequenced ambiguity, a formula in which Iran announces it is reopening the Strait pending diplomatic engagement, while the United States privately commits to resuming a specific track of nuclear or sanctions talks that had previously been suspended. Neither side confirms the deal publicly. Iran says it is reopening as a demonstration of goodwill. The United States says it welcomes the decision while maintaining its position that no concessions were made. This is exactly the formula used in the 2015 prisoner release negotiations and in the preliminary contacts that preceded the JCPOA. The conditions that make this possible are present. Oman is available, China has incentives to facilitate, and both the United States and Iran have demonstrated repeatedly that they can find this kind of ambiguous middle ground. What makes it difficult right now is the clock. Every day the Strait remains closed, the economic pressure on Asian importers builds, and the political pressure on Washington to take unilateral action increases. The window for a quiet resolution is likely 72 to 96 hours. After that, the public statements become too hardened, the market dislocations too severe, and the domestic political dynamics in Washington too inflamed for a quiet solution to hold. The second scenario is continued attrition. What happens if neither escalation nor resolution occurs in the first week? In an attrition scenario, the Strait remains effectively closed to commercial traffic, while legal and diplomatic negotiations proceed in parallel with low-level military posturing. The costs in this scenario are not dramatic. They are grinding. Oil remains above $110 per barrel, driving global inflation. The Asian importers begin drawing down strategic reserves at rates that will become publicly alarming within 3 weeks. Shipping routes are partially rerouted. Tankers begin the 15,000-kilometer journey around Cape of Good Hope, adding approximately 20 to 25 days to voyage times, which effectively removes the transit capacity of hundreds of vessels from the global fleet, tightening supply further and adding $3 to $5 per barrel in additional shipping cost. Airlines in South Asia and East Asia begin fuel surcharges. Petrochemical plant operators in Singapore and South Korea begin rationing feedstocks. None of this breaks the global economy in 3 weeks. But it begins to. The week-by-week cost of a sustained attrition scenario is approximately $15 to $20 billion in destroyed economic value globally, an estimate from the IMF's Maritime Disruption Modeling published in 2022 and still considered broadly accurate. The third scenario is catastrophic escalation, and this is the scenario that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. The threshold for catastrophic escalation is not a U.S. decision to force the Strait open. Military planners have wargamed that operation extensively and believe it is executable within 72 to 96 hours of authorization with significant but manageable risk. The threshold that produces uncontrolled escalation is a different event entirely. It is an Iranian strike on a U.S. naval vessel or a U.S. naval vessel under the pressure of close quarters operations in a mined waterway, firing on an Iranian vessel in ambiguous circumstances that produces casualties. That event, if it occurs, creates a mandatory American escalatory response that the domestic political environment will not permit the White House to constrain. An American president who absorbs a naval casualty in the Strait of Hormuz and does not respond with overwhelming force is a president who cannot survive the subsequent news cycle. The response in that scenario will not be surgical. It will be designed to be visible and disproportionate. What comes after that? Here is where the scenario becomes genuinely terrifying in ways that official assessments are reluctant to specify. Iran has hardened its retaliatory options over the last decade. Hezbollah in Lebanon holds a missile arsenal of 100,000 to 150,000 projectiles, a force capable of saturating Israeli and U.S. regional base air defenses through sheer volume, even accounting for Iron Dome and David's Sling intercept rates. Iranian proxies in Iraq hold positions within striking distance of U.S. military facilities that cannot be fully evacuated in a crisis timeline. A full Iranian escalation package, triggered by an American strike on IRGC assets, would simultaneously activate multiple fronts across a geographic space stretching from the Mediterranean to the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb. This is not a scenario anyone in Washington, Tehran, or the Gulf capitals wants. The fact that it exists as a genuine possibility, not a remote one, is precisely why the next 96 hours of diplomatic activity matter as much as the next 96 hours of military positioning. Let me now draw the lines that connect this map to your living room because these connections are real and they are already moving. Watch the price of diesel fuel in the next 7 days. Diesel is the fuel of freight. Every truck, every container ship, every farm machine runs on it. A sustained closure of Hormuz, even partially offset by strategic reserve releases, will produce a diesel price increase of 25 to 40 cents per gallon in the United States within 2 weeks. That increase will pass through immediately into the cost of delivering every physical good in your economy. Watch the price of plastics and synthetic materials. Petrochemical feedstocks, naphtha, ethylene, propylene are derivatives of the crude oil and gas flows that move through Hormuz. A tightened feedstock market will be felt in packaging, medical supplies, automotive components, and consumer electronics manufacturing within 30 days. Watch the Indian rupee. India's foreign exchange reserves are closely tied to its ability to manage its oil import bill, which is denominated in dollars. A sustained oil price spike above $120 per barrel materially stresses India's current account balance and puts downward pressure on the rupee. A weaker rupee tightens credit conditions across South Asian markets and raises the cost of dollar-denominated imports across the board. Watch Japanese government bond yields. Japan's entire economic model, its ability to maintain near-zero interest rates, its export manufacturing competitiveness, is contingent on stable energy input costs. A severe energy price shock forces Japanese industry to absorb cost or pass it forward, and the Bank of Japan faces a policy environment that becomes considerably more complicated. Watch the price of wheat. This is the last link in the chain, and it takes the longest to materialize, but it is the most consequential for the largest number of people. The nitrogen fertilizer constraint that flows from a disrupted LNG supply, a 60-day scenario, not a 72-hour one, will reduce the application rates for the spring agricultural cycle in markets that depend on LNG-linked fertilizer supply. Smaller harvests in those markets tighten global grain supplies. Tighter grain supplies raise food prices in import-dependent economies across North Africa and South Asia. This is not abstract. This is a direct line from a closed waterway in the Persian Gulf to the price of bread in Cairo, Karachi, and Nairobi. The Strait of Hormuz that existed before this morning is not coming back. Even if it reopens in 72 hours, and that remains possible, the market's understanding of its vulnerability has permanently changed. Insurance underwriters will now price Hormuz risk differently. Governments that have relied on strategic reserves as a theoretical backstop will be forced to examine whether those reserves are actually adequate. Asian importers who built their energy security frameworks around affordable, reliable Gulf crude access will accelerate their diversification investments. None of this unwinds in a week. The strategic and commercial architecture of global energy supply has been stress-tested this morning in a way it had not been before, and the result of that test will reshape decisions that are made in boardrooms and budget ministries for years. Here is the question that this moment leaves genuinely open. Iran has now demonstrated that it possesses the capability and willingness to close the strait. That demonstration once made cannot be unmade, which means the credible threat of closure is now permanent. It will exist as a variable in every energy security calculation, every tanker insurance contract, every Gulf diplomatic negotiation from this point forward. The question is not whether the Strait will be open tomorrow. The question is what kind of world exists now that the world knows it can be closed. That question does not have an answer in the next 72 hours. It may not have one for years. And the answer will depend on decisions being made right now in rooms we cannot see. Watch the Omani Foreign Ministry. Watch the Chinese State Council. Watch the U.S. Fifth Fleet's operational posture. Those 3 data points in the next 48 hours will tell you more about where this is going than anything on the front page. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening, not the headlines, not the noise, but the full picture, share it with someone who needs to see it.